I've got something for you, or I've got this for you. That's what Bryan Wayne Hulsey said as he stepped out of the car. And this individual here, the person with the red tie and the glasses, as he was stepping from the car and saying his words, he took out a gun and took that gun and shot Officer Anthony Hawley of the Glenville Police Department in the face. Officer Anthony Hawley was just there as a backup for another officer who was conducting a traffic stop. Officer Anthony Hawley, who was just there doing his duty that February 19th, 2007, almost 7 years ago, sometime around 7:30 in the morning. And this individual here, the defendant, whom with the red tie, who wasn't even the driver of the car. The car was actually being driven by a woman, an individual by the name of Jora Casias. She also is known, or was known, as Nikki. Nikki was the person who was driving the car, and in the front seat with her was the defendant, this individual here. But there was also somebody else in the car. In the back seat of the car was somebody by the name of Patsy Jones. And also in the back seat was a dog by the name of Kraut. And this dog belonged to Jora Casias, or Nikki. And the reason that the three of them had actually gone to Glenville was because Patsy Jones had a couple of kids who were in Glenville with her brother at the general area of 60th Avenue in Oregon. But she was staying in Mesa. But what happened with the kids is that previous day, February 18th, 2007, sometime in the mid-afternoon, her nephew came and took the kids so that her two kids could go to a birthday party in Glendale. But this nephew, rather than returning the kids back to Patsy Jones that evening, took them to her brother and his house or apartment, which is roughly in the area of 60th Avenue in Oregon. And so that evening, Patsy had a decision to make. She needed to go get her kids, or she could leave them till the morning. She wanted to get the kids that evening, but she didn't have the car. To be honest, or to be upfront about it, Patsy Jones didn't have much. Not only did she not have a car, she really didn't have a place to stay. She was actually staying with her ex-husband, an individual by the name of William Jones. And he also goes by another name, or a nickname, of Too Tall. Patsy Jones was still married to Too Tall, or Mr. Jones, but they were separated. She had been told that she had cancer and that she was terminally ill and was going to die. So she didn't have a place to stay, and she was under treatment. She, in fact, her head didn't have any hair on it. And she was staying at this apartment, Too Tall's apartment, along with Too Tall and her two kids. One of the kids was hers and Too Tall's together. Well, she was staying at this apartment and had a decision to make. Had to go get her kids because her brother didn't want them there in the morning because he had to go to work. Even though the next day was President's Day, which was February 19th of 2007, even though it was President's Day, her brother was going to go to work. So initially, Patsy went to a neighbor that lived in a house, not in the apartment. She went to this neighbor and she asked him, "Do you mind taking me out to Glenville so I can pick up my kids?" Well, it was a little bit far for the neighbor, and the neighbor said, "No, I can't do it." And this neighbor's name was John. Well, Patsy didn't really have anybody to turn to, and at that point didn't know how she was going to get the kids. At some point, Nikki, or Jora Casias, showed up. And the reason that Nikki or Jora Casias would show up at the apartment is that Nikki also had a previous relationship with Too Tall, which is Patsy's husband that she was living with. And they had a child in common that everybody called John John. So you have John down the road, and then you have John John the son. And John John had just moved out from the apartment that was now being occupied by Patsy, 2 kids, and Mr. Jones. And in the room, when John left, he had taken certain things. One of the things he had taken was Patsy Jones's driver's license and her birth certificate. And that evening of February 18th, 2007, Nikki came over for a number of reasons. She came over to return Patsy Jones's driver's license and her birth certificate, as well as to pack up the remaining articles that were there that were left behind by John after he had moved. And John was her son with Tutal. So she gets there, and one of the first things that Patsy Jones asks is, I need a ride to Glendale. I need a ride to Glenville, to the area of 60th Avenue in Oregon, because I need to pick up my kids. Well, Nikki was driving a Kia that didn't have a license plate. It did have a temporary registration, and it had a cracked windshield. It was Kia. And so Nikki said, sure, but I can't do it right now. She just couldn't do it at that point. And so but Nikki had another agenda. She had other things to do. And this agenda was an agenda with another individual, somebody else, which required her to go somewhere. And she asked Patsy, well, do you know somebody who has a car? Even though Nikki already had the Kia. I need to go find someone. I need to go look for someone. Patsy went down the road to talk to John, the person who would not take her to Glendale, asked for a favor to go around the Mesa area, because they were in Mesa. And this individual said, well, it's close, Mesa, and his name is John. I will take you. And he drove a Jeep. They get into the car, and as they're driving along, they come to a stoplight. And Nikki has been talking to somebody on the phone, very, very animated in the conversation. They come to a stoplight, and Nikki gets out of the car. Well, John, the driver, and Patsy Jones don't know what to do, and so they turn around and they come back to the apartment without Nikki. When Patsy Jones is back, much to her surprise, there's Nikki. She's already come back. She beat her back to the apartment. But Nikki is not alone. She's with an individual, another individual with her, that's with her, and this individual is Brad. And this Brad is an individual that maybe she wanted to go find, but she left without him, came back, and now she's with Brad. Brad sits in this courtroom today. Person with glasses, red tie. That's Brad. That's how he was introduced to Patsy. So they sit around and they go inside the apartment that Patsy is staying at, along with Tutal. And it's in the evening now. It's dark. Patsy wasn't keeping track, doesn't know times, but it was dark. And they're sitting there and they're talking. Well, as they continue talking, at some point, Brad, who is carrying what can only be called a man purse, thing that wraps around your neck, small circular kind of purse that's about maybe 10 inches by 6 inches, something like that. He's carrying that around in the apartment. He keeps looking out the window. He's kind of sweating. He just keeps looking around. But at some point, he takes out a pipe, a glass pipe. And he takes out this glass pipe, and he takes out a substance, speed, as Patsy Jones would call it, methamphetamine. He puts the speed in the pipe, lights it up, and he takes a drag out of it, smokes it, begins to smoke it. He then gives the pipe over to Jora Casias. He gives the pipe over to Jora Casias.
Do we have an issue? Yes.
Need another pen.
You need another pen? We'll get you another pen. Do we have one?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
Brad, the defendant, gives the pipe over to Nikki, Jora Casias, who puts the flame underneath it and also begins to smoke. At the time that he does that, Brad turns to Patsy and says, "Want to get high?" or words to that effect. He wants them. And Patsy says, "Sure, I'll go ahead." And she also takes a smoke out of it. And she does smoke once out of this pipe, just like the others. At that point, Nikki, or sometime thereafter, shortly thereafter, Nikki asks Patsy whether or not she and Brad can take a shower. The thing is that right about this time, Nikki starts calling the defendant Bryan. And Patsy notices that first it's Brad, then it's Bryan, and she sort of asks the defendant about him. She says, well, it's really Bryan, but it's Brad. Just says that. Well, Brad, or Bryan, defendant, however you want to call him, along with Nikki, or also known as Jora, they go into the bathroom to take a shower. And this is a long shower. It takes approximately an hour. The two of them are inside that shower for approximately an hour. And then shower, come out, and still, though, there hasn't been any packing that has taken place. And so at some point they begin to pack some of the items that belong to John so that Jora can take them with her in the Kia. They begin to pack these, and nothing gets into the Kia. At some point they do take them in and they take them out, but nothing is actually that belongs to John is actually put in the Kia. But Brad, the defendant, and Nikki decide to leave. And again, this is at night. And again, Patsy Jones will not be able to tell you that it was this time or that time. She can give you the sequence, but she cannot give you the exact time. At that point, Brad takes off in the Kia with Nikki, and Nikki is driving. Jora Casias is driving. They're gone for a certain period of time, some time. Then they come back. When they come back, Jora Casias has now brought something with her. She's brought the dog Kraut with her. It's just a Rottweiler that she brought back with her, brings it up into the apartment, and they begin to talk again. By now, it's getting close to morning, and Patsy is starting to get a little worried because she has to get to her kids before the morning. And it is, now it's February 19th, and even though the sun comes up a little bit late, she's noticing that it's starting to get pretty early now, and she needs to get over to pick up her kids in Glenville, in the general area of 60th Avenue in Oregon. Well, as she tells him about it, Nikki says, yes, this will get done. This will get done. So they're sitting there, and it's getting close to 6 o'clock. And 6 o'clock can be benchmarked because Too Tall works in cabinetry somewhere out in Mesa, and he leaves the house around 6 o'clock in the morning. And so around 6 o'clock in the morning, Too Tall goes to work. So now the people that are left in the apartment are Patsy Jones, Brad, the individual in court today, Bryan, however he wants to be called, and then Nikki, and also the dog. Before they take off, Brad pulls out the pipe again and says, anybody want to take another hit, or words to that effect. And the pipe is lit, and the three of them each begin to use speed or methamphetamine again before they go on this drive with Nikki driving. And as I told you, it is now past 6 o'clock in the morning, and they need to get over to Patsy Jones's brother's house out in Glendale, which is quite a ways, and he needs to get to work that morning. And so they get into the Kia, the one without the license plate, the one with a temporary registration in the back part of the car, and a cracked windshield, and they begin driving, or taking the drive, out to Glendale. And as they're driving along, they take I-17 or the freeway, and Costas gets off on Camelback and begins driving westbound on Camelback. Right about the time that she begins driving there, or a little bit before, around 6 o'clock, because we don't know exactly when she took off driving. It may have been shortly after Too Tall left. It was sometime after 6 o'clock. Right about that time, Officer David Coidia of the Glenville Police Department starting his day. He starts at 6 o'clock in the morning, at the same time as Too Tall, different profession. And one of the first things that he does, it's not a day that's out of the ordinary, it's just his job, he's just going on duty, is that he goes to a briefing. And at this briefing, they discuss things to look out for, things that they need to be careful or about, or just general information. That briefing, as they call it, lasts maybe 15, 20, 25 minutes. Officer Goya gets out, gets into his marked Glenville Police Department officer. He is dressed as a Glenville police officer. There's no mistaking that. He's got the shield, he's got the emblem, he's got the car that has the overhead lights on it, and on the side of the car is the emblem that indicates that this is a Glenville Police Department officer that's driving this car. Takes that car, and he goes over to the area where they get their gasoline, and he fills it up with gasoline in anticipation of the day. So by now, this time it's around 6:30, maybe 6:45 in the morning. And he decides to head out to the general area of 57th Avenue and Camelback. And the reason that he's going there is that that area is known for perhaps having some activity that the police like to take a look at. And he's also, there's a deterrent, he'll tell you, because if the people see a police officer, less criminal conduct is less likely to occur. And of course, he's there for enforcement purposes. And he's sitting there, facing southbound, looking at the traffic as he goes by that President's Day. And one of the things that he notices, sometime around 7 o'clock in the morning, as he's sitting there in his patrol car, is he notices this Kia go by, a silver kind of Kia go by. And he notices that it's driving very fast, or it's speeding. And it catches his eye, and he decides that he's going to investigate this, that he's going to follow it, he's going to stop the car, because it's speeding, which is something that he does. That's something the police do. And so he begins to follow the car and gets behind it going westbound on Camelback Road. He's not immediately behind the car, but he starts speeding up to try to catch up to it. And as he's getting closer, he notices it doesn't have a plate. And so he begins to and by plate I mean license plate, and he begins to get closer as the car then takes a right northbound on 59th Avenue. Now he's starting to get a little bit closer. And then, a short block or so later, he notices that the car takes a left onto Oregon. And he's much closer now as the Kia takes a left onto Oregon to go westbound. He's very close. He's so close that the people inside the car now notice him. The lights are not on yet, but they notice him. And at that time, it's about 7:15 in the morning. The sun is already out, but he still has his headlights on. He doesn't have his overheads on, but it's light enough out, and it's kind of that time of the day where you can have your lights on or not. But he has his lights on. He can see without the use of the lights, and he gets behind the car. And the people inside the car, the Kia, notice him. As the car then takes a right, which would be northbound onto 60th Avenue, and that's the area they are going to drop Patsy Jones off, it pulls over to the right. Not because the officer has turned the overhead lights on, but because that's the area that they're going to drop Patsy Jones off. But as they begin to take that turn, one of the things that Bryan, whatever you want to call him, does is he takes the pipe and he takes the methamphetamine, gives it to Patsy Jones and says, "Get rid of this. Get rid of them." Patsy takes them. Doesn't know what to do with them. She's sitting in the back seat with Kraut. She didn't know what to do with them, but takes them anyway. And as she's sitting there, knowing that the police are behind them, sticks them underneath the seat. Takes the pipe, what she believes to be speed, and sticks them underneath the pipe and sits there. The car comes to a stop, and it comes to a stop on the right side of the road appropriately, and the three of them start to get out of the car because, again, this is their end destination. Patsy's now going to go over to her kids. Right about the time that they start, when they go to get out of the car, Officer David Goya, who has made a decision to stop the car, turns on the overhead lights and gets behind the Kia. At the same time, right about that time, he radios in to the dispatcher what he's doing, and he says, "I need a slow roll. A slow roll is just a backup. I need somebody, another officer, to come with me on this." It's not that he suspects anything. It's not that he thinks that anything's wrong. This is just a run-of-the-mill traffic stop, but he requests a slow roll. It's not a fast roll. And the person that he talks to, the dispatcher, then goes on the radio and asks people, officers, at this stop that's taking place at 60th Avenue in Oregon, which one of you wants to take this call and be the backup? Well, other people responded to this backup. Ned Wilkins, for example, another officer responded to this backup. Other officers are thinking that they're going to respond to it, but they're told not to. They're told not to respond to this call. And the reason that they're told not to respond to this call is because Officer Anthony Hawley was first. He's the person that answered the call. He's the individual that answered what was going to be his last call, the call of death. And he starts driving to the area of 60th Avenue in Oregon. Officer David Godia does not wait for the backup. Doesn't wait for Hawley. Officer Hawley, no. What he does is he actually gets out of the car and approaches the driver, goes up to the driver, who you now know as Costas, Jora Casias, Nikki, and starts talking to her. And he asks the questions that all police officers ask. But one of the things he asks is for a driver's license. And then he looks at the other two. He looks at Brad. Then he looks at Patsy Jones and he says, I need your identification. Jora Casias does not have any identification on her. So the officer has a card, what is called a field interrogation card or a 36 card, whatever name they give it, and he writes down her name and her identifying information, but doesn't have any official ID. Patsy Jones, as you now know, she just got the license of her driver's license back, so she gets the driver's license and gives it to the officer. And Brad, the passenger, also gives a driver's license. Bradley Hulsey, that's the name on the driver's license. Gives it to the police officer. Right when this is going on, when this conversation is taking place, Officer Anthony Hawley arrives at the scene. And he parks next to Officer David Godia's car. And he goes to assume the backup position. And the backup position is he goes over to the passenger side of the car. If you remember, Officer David Godia was on the driver's side. He is on the passenger side, sort of standing there between the front and the back passenger seat. And as he's standing there, Officer Godia mentions to him to take a look at the temporary registration that's in the back there. Take a look at it sort of in a way, something that you need to take a look at. And Officer David Godia then goes to his computer to check out these individuals to find out more about them, which is what law enforcement does. So he went to his computer. And when he goes to his computer, Officer Hawley then asks Patsy Jones to roll the window down so that he could reach in and get the temporary registration that's on the back window. He's not able to get it, but he asks Patsy Jones to give it to him, and she complies.